Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Insignia Lounge and the first of our enrichment lectures on this particular leg of our tour going from Sydney to Papeete. And so I can't wait for me to get to Tasmania. My name is not Commander Don Campbell. I'm the cruise director, Andy, and I just wanted to introduce Don to you. Also, just to give you a little heads up that we've got a little technical challenge with our center screen, and so I'm sure we'll get that taken care of. But we've got the two side screens, so all is well. But our guest speaker today is Don Campbell. He's a graduate of the United States Coast Guard Academy with his degree in engineering. After a 24-year career in achieving the rank of commander, Don earned his MBA, entered the aerospace and defense industries, including top-secret clearance for his work with the stealth bomber, the Mars lander, the presidential helicopter, and the Royal Aircraft Program in Wales. So, of course, that's why you're speaking about Tasmania and the Tasmanian Devil today. That's right. No, Don has taught at university levels. He's led development teams for large software firms. He and his wife, Susan, she's of course traveling with us, has toured the world visiting over 150 countries, making them popular and highly sought after presenters for Oceania. So if you would, please join me in a very warm welcome to Commander Don Campbell.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this. It's actually the first in a series of presentations about the places that we're going to go, and I include the ocean in that, by the way, during the cruise. And for those of you who just joined us in Sydney, a warm welcome aboard. For those of you who are continuing on with us or have continued on with us from the last couple of segments, welcome home. Anyway, we're going to cover all the ports, as I said, on this itinerary, and we hope to pass along some kind of unique tidbits of useful information. Although some of you may think, well, I'm not sure that's useful, but that's okay. Anyway, they're going to have a whole variety of material that'll talk about a little bit about history of the area, must-see attractions sometimes, local foods occasionally, and occasionally a quickie trip tip that'll kind of enhance your journey a little bit into the town. We hope it'll be a lot of fun as well as informational. And be sure to watch your currents. That's where they'll show you where the future talk, well, not where, they're always going to be here. But it'll give you the time and the date of future talks. This lecture is going to be about Tasmania, or Taz, or Tassie as the locals call it. And I was going to do the Aussie thing, but I was afraid everybody'd start doing oi, 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 so we won't do that. Anyway, Tasmania is a part of the Commonwealth of Australia, and it's an island that was originally connected to the mainland until the end of the last ice age. That was maybe 10,000 years ago, and today it's about 240 kilometers, but for those of us that are metrically challenged, that's about 150 miles south of the mainland. Helps if I have the right button, excuse me. My wife hates it when I talk to the computer. It doesn't talk back, that's why I do it. Anyway. Tasmania's main island is roughly heart-shaped, as you can see in the lower part of this picture. It has a maximum length and width of about 200 miles. Hobart is the state capital. Tasmania's land area of 68,000 square kilometers, or about 26,000 square miles, and it's located right in the pathway of what's called the Roaring Forties. For those of you who don't understand that, when you get to 40 degrees south latitude, there's a long band of uninterrupted wind that goes all the way around the globe and builds up some tremendous storms. So it's really notorious for some very, very fierce winds. Actually, it might be exciting when we leave Hobart, but I don't know. I hope it'll be like it was today as we leave. But we know, those of you who were with us from Brisbane down to Sydney knows it gets a little bumpy at times. So anyway, we'll have a good time in any event. Anyway, the strong east to west or west to east air currents are caused by that combination of air being displaced from the equator because of just the Coriolis effect of the Earth and the Earth's rotation, and there are very few land masses to slow it down. There are many geological features on Tasmania, and the state's geodiversity is the result of continental drift, as well as the ice ages, also humid and hot conditions, and earthquakes that occurred over 1 billion years ago. So this is not a new piece of rock, but it's a piece of rock that's been shaped quite a bit. It's the most mountainous of all the states in Australia, and the tallest mountain is Mount Ossa at over 1,500 meters, or about a mile high. The Great Dividing Range in eastern Australia actually continues south into Tasmania, and that was formed by the collision of two tectonic plates, the Australian plate and the Pacific plate came together and it pushed the mountains up. And that mountain building event generated tremendous amounts of heat and caused a lot of volcanic activity. The heat melted the Earth's crust deep below the surface, and that produced a lot of magma and molten rock. And then when it cooled, it formed into large, very distinct columnar joints. Now, this is what's known as the organ pipes on Mount Wellington. It's a great example of those columnar joints, and it's from this stunning vantage point, some 4,000 feet above sea level, that you can actually get some beautiful sweeping views of Tassie. Now, Tasmania has been volcanically inactive in recent geologic times, and when you think about geologic times, we're talking hundreds of thousands and even millions of years. Now, Mount Wellington is frequently snow-covered, sometimes even in the summertime. Now, for those of you who came from the States, this is not summer. This is late fall down here, so we're getting close to winter, so you might be able to see some snow. And lower slopes are thickly forested, and they're crisscrossed by walking trails and a few fire trails. Another interesting geologic formation in Tasmania is shown here. It's known as tessellated pavements. Now, this type of rock is gets the name tessellated because the rocks are fractured into almost perfectly square blocks that resemble the tiles of a mosaic floor. It's relatively flat, and it's segmented into these more or less regular shapes by erosion and by weathering. And all of those little seams that you see there are just little like bumps made with algae that fits in between the rocks. It's almost like having a paved patio. Hastings Caves were discovered here back in 1917 by timber workers. Why the timber workers were walking around underground, I have no idea. The Dolomite Caves have some spectacular subterranean formations that include stalactites and stalagmites. And near the caves, outside by the way, is a thermal pool that's fed by a natural spring. And it's about 28 degrees Celsius or about 82 degrees or so Fahrenheit. And you can swim there if you'd like. The pool sits outside the caves near a visitor center that's among a lot of tropical growth. So when you're sitting in the pool, you can close your eyes and imagine a refreshing dip in a warm pool while surrounded by a forest and fern. Kind of like being in a hot tub up on deck 10. Or 9, excuse me. Geographically and genetically isolated, Tasmania is known for its unique flora and fauna. Now, some are related to species that are found in South America and in New Zealand. Because this happened millions and millions of years ago, and they all lived together on a supercontinent that was called Gondwana, and that was all together back about 500 million years ago and broke up about 150 million years ago. The Tarkine is located in Tasmania's far northwest, and it's the largest temperate rainforest area in Australia. Now, if you are so indicated, you can walk from treetop to treetop. They have these suspended walkways if you want to go across, and you'll be right up in the canopy of the rainforest. Now, I have to kind of tell you, it's a little bit of a wiggly wobbly sort of a walkway, and it's about 100 feet above the ground, so if you're queasy about heights, you might want to pass on that one. Tasmania became known as the Apple Isle because it was once one of the world's major producers of apples. The first apple tree was planted here by Captain Bligh in the 1700s. You probably remember him. He was the British guy who was the victim in the mutiny on the Bounty. Anyway, from the 1820s onward, an ever-increasing surplus was exported to English settlements all across Australia. And the apples are still grown in large numbers, particularly in southern Tasmania, and due to their veritable pest-free status. I mean, they don't have very many bugs down here that bother the apples. The Tasmanian apples have the distinction of being the first approved by the Japanese government for import. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a rapid decline in the traditional crops such as apples and pears, and other crops and industries rose to take their place. Now, during the 15 years up until about 2010, new agricultural products such as saffron and chrysanthemums and cherries have emerged here on the island. Those products, along with wine grapes, have been fostered by the Tasmanian Institute of Agricultural Research. Speaking of which, Susie has a cousin who headed the institute and funded a university scholarship in agricultural science. It was at Mount Nelson where the testing ground for the wine industry in Tasmania began, and the chair was named in his honor at the University of Australia. Dr. Robert Maneri continues to live in the Hobart area, where he's now researching the cultivation of the Boronia flower for its oil. And it's kind of interesting because that oil is used for perfumes and as food additive to enhance fruit flavors. And also, these little guys here are out checking out the vineyards to make sure that all the grapes are healthy. Now, as far as fauna goes, the island of Tasmania was the home to the Tasmanian tiger. It was a marsupial that kind of looked like a wild dog. The tiger was known because of the distinctive striping across its back, and it became extinct about 70 years ago, and that was due to competition for food from the dingo. That made the Tasmanian devil one of the largest wild carnivorous marsupials in the world. Now, the devil was named because of its weird and terrifying screams and snarls that disturbed the shepherds during their peaceful sleep. But it's now endangered and is found only in the wild areas of Tasmania. It's not really running around in the neighborhoods. Today, scientists are calling for the reintroduction of the Tasmanian devil. Isn't he cute? It's kind of a nice-looking little guy. I wouldn't consider him a real terror. Anyway, they want to use him to combat feral cats. That's an attempt to reestablish an ecological balance between the cats and foxes and native wildlife. The program wants to breed about 300 devils and turn them loose by 2016. Now, on the northern outskirts of Hobart is the Bunurongong, that's a tough name, I'd like to say that about 4 times real fast. Anyway, Wildlife Park, and you can see the Tasmanian devil in captivity there. They also have wombats and koalas and some free-roaming kangaroos, so those of you who haven't had an opportunity to see that, that might be of great interest. Another place to see them is at the Tasmanian Devil Conservation Park, and that's on the way out to Port Arthur, and the park itself is about an hour from Hobart. Tasmania was first inhabited by the Aborigine, and evidence indicates their presence in the region goes back at least 40,000 years. Now, the Australian archaeologists have uncovered what they believe to be the world's southernmost site of early human activity. Now, at a tribal meeting ground, up to 3 million artifacts, including stone tools, shellfish fragments, and food scraps, have been found. Now, polygamous by custom, they were affectionate by disposition. They sang and danced strenuously, and they frequently had lascivious animal dances. I'm not quite sure what a lascivious animal dance is, but if I let my imagination go, I think I can figure it out. Anyway, their small tribal bands seldom strayed outside their own small hunting circles. Now, shown here is a woman who was known as Truganini. She died in 1876, and she is generally recognized as having been the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aborigine. There's a little bit of conflict over this because there is some evidence that suggests that the true survivor was another woman who was named Fanny Cochran Smith, who died in 1905. It's been reported that the tribes were famous for their defiant stand against the settlers, and that frustration led the authorities to ultimately issue an order that any Aborigine was to be shot on sight. Some were shot simply so the settlers could take their land, and many others were imprisoned until they died. Australia's original inhabitants are believed to have numbered somewhere around 1 million at the time of European settlement, and today there are some 470,000 that remain. They are also Australia's most impoverished minority. The first reported sighting of Tasmania by a European was in 1642, and that was by the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman. He landed just south of Hobart, and he named the land in honor of Anthony van Diemen. Now, Van Diemen was a governor general of the Dutch East Indies settlements. He was revered for securing Ceylon cinnamon producing areas and seizing key Portuguese strongholds of Malacca for the Dutch. He also captured all of Formosa and drove out the Spanish. Now, Van Diemen's land was officially renamed Tasmania in honor of the first European discoverer, and that occurred back in 1856. Now, Abel Tasman was the first European to reach the islands of New Zealand and Tasmania, and he claimed the land by leaving behind a Dutch flag and the words Dutch East India marked on it. He mapped the coast before continuing across the Tasman Sea into the islands of New Zealand. When Tasman returned to Jakarta, the Governor General was really upset with him because he didn't find any gold or lucrative trading opportunities. But Tasman's voyages were the last efforts made by the Dutch to chart Australia, which they then called New Holland. Reports circulated by the Dutch that there were no opportunities for trade anywhere within this area, and soon other European countries basically lost interest in the area. So it was more than 100 years later that Captain James Cook came here in 1777. Now he had a young officer with him. Actually, it was his sailing master by the name of William Bligh. Bligh returned 2 more times to the island, once on HMS Bounty, but however, Tasmania wasn't proved to be an island until 1798. So it took a long time for people to actually go all the way around it. I don't know why. Anyway, after the American Revolutionary War, Britain could no longer send her convicts to North America. After 1788, they began to transport them to the Australian colonies. These men and women were imprisoned for crimes that seemed pretty trivial by today's standards. Most of them were convicted of stealing small articles, maybe pieces of food, or occasionally some livestock. Many of them had been found guilty more than once. Now, Britain's policy was to treat such reoffenders very harshly. Around 166,000 men, women, and children convicts were sent to Australia over an 80-year period. One of the ships they were transported on was the HMS Success. The convicts that were sent to Van Diemen's Land were most likely poor young people from rural areas or the slums of England's big cities. 1 in 5 of them was a woman. Numbers of children were also transported with their parents, and few of the relocated prisoners ever went back to the UK. In 1803, Lieutenant John Bowen was sent to establish a settlement in Van Diemen's Land, and on the advice of another explorer, he chose Risdon Cove, about 4 miles north of present-day Hobart. Now, the site was a good one from a defensive standpoint. The soil was poor and the water was scarce. There were 49 people with Bowen that made a curious party of soldiers and sailors and settlers and convicts. Beside the officers and 2 free settlers, there were 21 male convicts, an overseer, and 3 women. Now, about 2 months later, the colony increased to 100 people. Now, that was because more people came in, not because of anything that happened with the families. About 300 Aboriginal men, women, and children stumbled into the British settlement. Now, they were hunting kangaroos during a seasonal migration of those animals across the island, and some of the Aborigines were upset by the presence of the new colonists. A soldier mistakenly thought they were under attack, and the soldiers themselves fired and killed some of the intruders in what was known as the Risdon Cove Massacre in 1804. With a lack of water, the early settlers soon moved on to what is now Hobart. That location was named after the British colonial secretary of the time, Lord Hobart. As a postscript to the story about Risdon Cove, by the 150th anniversary of the massacre, Risdon Cove land was acquired by the state government of Tasmania, and it was added to the Aboriginal Reserve. The handover, which included Risdon Cove and a memorial, was part of the Aborigines Land Bill. That transfer occurred in 1995. The historical relics that have since fallen into disrepair, and you can only see a few of the monuments and stuff there today. Back in the early days, the settlers in Tasmania, mostly convicts and their military guards, were tasked with developing agriculture and other industries in Van Diemen's Land. Numerous other convict-based settlements were established, and one of these was the particularly harsh colony known as Port Arthur. The Port Arthur Disciplinary Settlement began as a small timber station in 1830. It quickly grew in importance with the penal system of the colonies. The initial decade of settlement here saw the stations hacking out from the brush itself. I mean, it was just forested land, and they just cut down the trees to make room for the prisons. The first factories, then they had several of them. They had shipbuilding, shoemaking, timber, and brick making at this prison were all established very early on. The Port Arthur Historic Site is the best preserved prisoner settlement in the country of Australia. It's a 242-acre site that's among the most significant convict-era sites in the world. It was entered on the UNESCO World Heritage Register in 2010. Now, more than 12,000 criminals passed through the system at Port Arthur. Shipbuilding was introduced here, as I said, on a large scale to provide selected convicts with a useful skill that they could use once they were freed. Up to 70 convicts were employed in the shipyard at its height, and the majority of them were engaged in the menial task of cutting and carrying timber. Now, the remaining convicts were carpenters, blacksmiths, caulkers, coopers, and shipwrights who actually built the ships. 15 large ships and over 140 smaller vessels were launched from Port Arthur. They had everything from whaleboats and rowboats to ships of pretty good size, and they were known for their craftsmanship and durability. Now you probably ask, why did I put in a whole thing about shipbuilding? Well, because you got to remember, my background came from the Coast Guard. Anyway, though successful, the shipbuilding operation at Port Arthur ceased on a large scale anyway. They cut way back after about 10 years. And I think it was because they were worried the convicts would figure out how to build boats to get away. Anyway, in 1840, there was a convict population at Port Arthur that had reached about 1,100 residents. They built a huge flour mill and a granary, and they also constructed the hospital. Now, when the first stone was laid for a separate prison, there was a shift in the penal philosophy from physical to mental suppression. Port Arthur expanded geographically as convict labor pushed farther and farther into the hills to cut more valuable timber. The next 2 decades were aimed at making the station economically sustainable. Extensive tracts of bush were harvested and large plots of ground were turned over for cultivation. Nearby, there were workshops using steam-driven sawmill, a blacksmith, and carpentry workshops. The old flour mill and granary were converted into cell blocks. In 1864, the last great project at the site was an asylum that was begun. Port Arthur's asylum was built in a classic cruciform shape. The wings were occupied by dormitories that were around a central mess hall. In keeping with the era, treatment was a soothing atmosphere. And the convicts were allowed to exercise. I'm not quite sure what soothing in a prison is all about, but anyway, they were allowed to exercise. Work was limited by the people at the asylum to tending gardens or chopping firewood. Now, after its closure, the asylum was severely damaged by a fire in 1895 that covered most of the bush. Now, recently, they built a scale model that was of the asylum that's in the museum at Port Arthur, and you can see what it really looked like. In the 1870s, the numbers of convicts dwindled, and those remaining behind were basically too old. They were aged, they were infirm, and they were insane, so they basically didn't have any use to anybody. The last convict was shipped out from the prison in 1877. Now, Port Arthur's story didn't end with the removal of the last convict. Almost immediately, the site was renamed Carnarvon, and the land was divided up and put up for auction for development. In 1996, in the incident now known as the Port Arthur Massacre, there was a lone 28-year-old man who shot and killed 35 people and injured 21 others. Most of it occurred at the historic prison colony, which by now was a very popular tourist site. The gunman was convicted and given 35 sentences of life without the possibility of parole. So I guess that would mean he'd be there for a long time. Anyway, if you go to the prison at the Colonial Historic Site, they kind of ask that you try not to discuss the massacre with the staff. And the reason is many of them lost close friends, colleagues, and even family members on that day, and they still find it difficult and painful to talk about. Instead, please read the plaques at the Memorial Garden or just pick up the brochure that's at the Visitor Center. The devastating events of that day encouraged Australia to question their laws on the private ownership of automatic and semi-automatic firearms. They had a vigorous national debate that was marked by very strongly held views on both sides of the issue. Eventually, both the federal and the state governments passed new gun control laws that are among the strictest in the world. There are a couple of optional side trips from Port Arthur Penal Colony. One is to the Isle of the Dead, located in the harbor off of Port Arthur. Between 1833 and 1877, about 100,000 burials took place. Well, it can't be 100,000. That island's not big enough. Must be 1,000. Took place out on the island. Anyway, also located across the harbor is Point Poor Boys Prison. It was the first reformatory that was built exclusively for juvenile male convicts in the British Empire. It was renowned for its regime of very stern discipline and harsh punishment. 3,000 boys, some as young as 9 years old, were sentenced to the prison between 1834 and 1849. Now, the drive from Hobart to Port Arthur takes about 90 minutes, so it's not the closest thing you can get to. It can take substantially longer if you take the time to look at the scenery along the way, which, by the way, is spectacular. Transportation from Hobart to the prison site is available by taxi, bus, and even by ferry. Now, the Cascades Female Factory is also among the 11 historic places that form the Australian convict site's World Heritage property. And this one is located basically in Hobart, where it was operated from 1828 to 1856. It became the largest colony factory and was expanded into 5 major courtyards and could accommodate 1,000 women and about 175 to 200 children. But with the area, it had damp swamp land, it was overcrowded, they had poor sanitation, very inadequate food and clothing, and there was a very high rate of disease and mortality among the inmates. Now, the last time Susie and I were here in Hobart, another cousin of hers, she's got cousins all over, I'll tell you, treated us to a tour of the Cascades and the Campbell Street Jail. He worked there as a docent. Now, Campbell Street Jail was not named for any of my rallies, and I'm not the one that was the cause of it. Anyway, the original portion of the jail was built by convicts in 1828, or 1821, excuse me. It could accommodate about 640 men, but because they had thousands of convicts that were arriving each year, the barracks was found to be much, much too small, because almost as soon as a ship got there, they had to take the convicts that were there and send them off to Port Arthur and then bring in another ship and so on. So they extended it in 3 stages over the next 10 years until it could hold about 1,200 men. Now, the complex consisted of a church built over solitary confinement. This was kind of interesting. You got a place of worship, and right below the place of worship are all the solitary confinement cells. It still contains courtrooms, tunnels, solitary cells, refectory and holding cells, and an execution yard with a gallows. Now, the church was converted to a prison chapel in the law courts in the late 1850s. The jail has never had toilets installed in its cells. Instead, they just use slop buckets. The Campbell Street Jail was one of the 3 prisons in Tasmania where executions could be carried out, and a total of 32 people, including 1 woman, were executed in the jail between 1857 and 1946. The scaffold for hanging, my wife wanted me to step out on a platform before they opened it, was restored in the 1980s and uses the original fixtures. Now, Margaret Coughlin was the last woman to be executed in Tasmania, and she was described as, quote, a gray-headed old woman, unquote. And she was also, like many residents of the colony, a transported convict. It was 1862, and she had been convicted for the murder of her husband. Now, the murder took place less than 6 weeks before she was hung, so justice was very swift in those days. The couple had had a drunken quarrel, and Margaret's husband threw an iron bar at her. She picked it up and beat him with it before she slit his throat. Lovely lady. Anyway, according to the newspaper coverage of the event at the time, Margaret made the usual scaffold speech. You know, you're standing there on a scaffold and they ask you if you're repenting for your sins and all that. And she acknowledged the foulness of her crime by saying, quote, drink the curse that has been on me. Strong drink has caused all my misery. Everything has been sacrificed for strong drink. May all forgive me whom I have injured, offended, or scandalized by my evil living, unquote. She didn't say much about her husband, though. Mark Jeffrey was another English convict that was transported to Tasmania, and he was jailed in the Campbell Street jail. He was known as Big Mark, originally transported for burglary. His determination to stand up for his rights earned him constant punishment. I guess he just liked being hurt. Anyway, most of they were disputes over food or other things that shaped his life. In 1866, he finally got his freedom. He was pardoned, but he couldn't work because of an injury to his leg, and he committed some more crimes, so he was sent back to Port Arthur as an invalid convict. Now, soon he was freed again because they figured he just couldn't do anymore because he was an invalid. But after a fight in a pub, he was convicted of manslaughter and sent back to Port Arthur for life. He wasn't happy there, so he smashed up his cell and tried to murder the doctor. Mark was sent to the Isle of the Dead as a grave digger, and when living alone on the island, he dug his own grave, which he very carefully tended. He put flowers around it, kept the grass all clean and everything else. It was a very nice place. Anyway, he patted down the sides with a spade because he didn't want the marauding worms to get into his grave. He wanted to keep them away. And there he claimed that the devil was his satanic majesty who appeared in his hut and spoke to him. Now, he was so frightened that he begged to be removed from the island, and they went along with him, so they sent him to the Hobart Jail on Campbell Street in 1877, where he racked up a few more convictions for things like assault. He spent several years in isolation under the chapel floor, and finally he was sent to the Invalid Depot, where he died in 1903 at the age of 78. Now, before his death, he wrote his autobiography, which today provides a really interesting insight into convict life in the jails of Australia. Now, these are just a few of the stories that we heard about the jail. Campbell Street Jail closed in 1963. Most of the buildings on the site were demolished, except for the courtrooms, the chapel, and the attached cells, and those remained in use until 1983. Now, what else is there to do in Hobart? Well, if the prison isn't your thing, maybe pop art is. There's a wealthy philanthropist named David Welch who opened a museum of old and new art, also called Mona, in Hobart, and it was internationally acclaimed. This was really a big deal. Within 12 months of opening, it became Tasmania's top tourist attraction, and Welch has described the museum as a subversive adult Disneyland. In all, there's a collection of 400 works of art that take up 3 floors, and it's a subterranean kind of a thing. And it's Australia's largest private museum and houses a collection that ranges from basically ancient Egyptian mummies to some of the world's most infamous and thought-provoking contemporary art. Now, when you enter this place, you actually come in on the upper level and you descend down a long staircase that leads to the bottom level, and that's 3 stories below ground level. And the art is displayed along the walk back up, a big long ramp. You walk back up to the surface, just the opposite the way the Guggenheim is set up in New York. Now, Mona is on a 7-acre site that also has, things like a winery, a microbrewery, a restaurant, and a theater. Now, to get there, visitors can take a high-speed ferry from Hobart waterfront to the museum, and that ferry takes about 30 minutes. One of Hobart's oldest and most historic areas is Battery Point, and that's just to the south of the Hobart Central Business District. Some of the sandstone buildings here have stood since about 1818. The architecture is reminiscent of a Cornish fishing village, and that's probably because many of the very early residents in Hobart were mariners and military guards who came from the Flemish areas or Cornish areas of England and around that area. Now, Runnymede is an elegant colonial house. It actually looks like a pretty modern house. It's situated in Newtown, just north of Hobart. It sits on a garden that overlooks the Newtown Bay and the River Derwent. Now, though it looks very modern, it was built back in the early 1800s, 1836 or so is when it was completed. The original owner was Robert Pitcairn, and he was the first lawyer to qualify to practice law in the colony. He was a leading campaigner against the transportation of convicts from Britain. Now today, Runnymede is a museum and they display domestic life in the colonies of the 1860s. And included in the house's collections are maritime history items and whaling artifacts, along with the family possessions from former residents who lived there. It's a pretty interesting museum. So if you'd rather relax, have a light meal or a drink and people watch, which is another popular thing to do in almost every place we go, in downtown Hobart, Salamanca Palace consists of rows of sandstone buildings. Now the place was named for 1812 victory of the Duke of Wellington in the Battle of Salamanca in Spain. Now these places were all originally warehouses for the port of Hobart Town, but they've been converted into restaurants and galleries and cafes and shops and offices and so on. It's a very interesting place, and on a nice day, and hopefully we will have a nice day, it's a great place to spend some time. And since it's located less than 20 miles from the Hobart Cruise Point, the Berea Bay Oyster Restaurant is worth going to and learning about how oysters live, and they begin as a tiny grain. And you can also learn the role that things like the tides, the weather, the environment play in the whole development of an oyster. And if you're lucky, you might find one that's got a pearl in it. Anyway, recently there have been a few reviews on TripAdvisor, for those of you that use that have been less than favorable about the restaurant, but most of those seem to have been more about the service and the attitude of the staff rather than about the food. Most of the people have said the food and the oysters is really very, very good. Anyway, if you like seafood and oysters in particular, the overall rating of this place is in the very good to excellent range. Well, that's it for today. Enjoy your time here in Hobart. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. The lecture will repeat on Channel 9 on your television. And if you want to discuss this or any of my presentations or anything about the cruise from here to basically Los Angeles, or in the past even, join me out in Baristas. That's the coffee place just outside the main dining room for those of you who just came aboard. And we can sit there and have a cup of coffee and a chat, and I'll buy the coffee. Anyway, watch your evening currents for the announcement of the next presentation, and I'd like to thank you very much. Have a great day.